All right, so the basic premise of what we're learning right now is how to take energy and transform it into a usable form. So an example I like to use is the $10 bill. So here we have a $10 bill and I need to go to the snack machine, and let's pretend it's an old snack machine. It can't make change. I need to have quarters. So how many quarters would I get if I gave somebody a $10 bill? 40 quarters. But it's kind of unrealistic that people are walking around with 40 quarters. So I need to make some change, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Okay, but basically I need to get quarters. And energy comes in different forms. Like, for example, sunlight energy. The source of all energy on the planet comes from the sun, one way or another. And we also have thermal energy, which is heat, and we've got chemical energy. So chemical energy would be like the energy stored in the granola bar that you're eating as a snack to give you more energy, for example. Another form of chemical energy is something called ATP, and we'll get to that in a couple minutes. ATP is adenosine triphosphate, tri because it has 3 phosphate groups, and it basically stores energy. And for our example, it would be like the quarters, okay? So, for example, you put a $10 bill in, and you're going to get 40 quarters. You're going to get like 40 molecules of ATP. Okay, we'll come back to that. So the main source of energy for animals, for humans, is carbohydrates. Yes, you can get energy from breaking down fats and proteins, but the primary source of energy for humans is carbs. And examples of carbs would be like pasta, bread, and flour. Now, all those come from plants, and plants make their own food from sunlight. So remember photosynthesis, you take sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water, and the chloroplasts transform that form of light energy into chemical energy stored in glucose, C6H12O6, and they also put off oxygen. So basically the carbs that, not basically, but exactly, the carbs that we eat contain energy that plants made from photosynthesis, okay? So we're going to take complex carbs and we're going to break them down into simple carbs, simple sugars, like glucose, for example. So for our example, let's use C6H12O6. That'll be glucose. That'll be our $10 bill, okay? All right, let's scooch down here. So here's the bloodstream that's going around our cell. Yeah, there's lots of stuff going in here, but let's break it down step by step. So basically, in the bloodstream here is lots of stuff, but we're going to start off with glucose. So that the pasta you ate last night for a pasta party, the complex carbs got broken down into simple carbs, glucose, and here you have glucose hanging out in your bloodstream. Okay, you also have oxygen hanging around your bloodstream. Hopefully, if you're breathing. Breathing's good. I highly recommend it. Okay, now glucose. To get glucose into the cell, we need to have a hormone called insulin. Insulin helps glucose get into the cells. People that have diabetes either don't make any insulin, don't make enough insulin, or the insulin they make doesn't really open up the doors in the cells to allow glucose in. So they usually have to either take injections of the hormone insulin, or they have to take oral meds, pills that help the insulin work better if they do produce some insulin. So the glucose gets into the cell right here. So we have C6H12O6, and again, that's our $10 bill. Well, the first thing to do to make change, because let's pretend again, I am really, really hungry, and I have a $10 bill, and I want to get some pretzels out of the snack machine, but unfortunately the snack machine is an old one and only takes quarters. So nobody around here walks around with 40 quarters in their pockets, like to give me change. But I'll bet you a bunch of you walk around with 2 5s. So what happens is, if I can break up my glucose, my $10 bill, into 2 5s, I'm partially there. Okay, my end goal is to get to quarters. Okay, so in the cells, glucose gets split into 2 substances called pyruvic acid, and this happens in the cytoplasm, and we call this glycolysis. Glyc is sugar, lysis to split, like lysosomes. Lysosomes split things apart, especially like proteins, for example, that are marked for destruction by the Golgi bodies. Okay, so glycolysis is the first step out of 3 of making lots of change. Now we get like 2 ATP from this, and we'll get to ATP in a couple minutes. Okay, so we get like 2 quarters out of doing this. Okay, now if we have oxygen present, which hopefully we do because we're hopefully breathing, so the oxygen is in the bloodstream, it hops into the cell. if we have oxygen present, we can then do the next 2 steps. Okay, I'm going to make this really simple for you. Step number 2 is called Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle. And step number 3 is electron transport chain. In order to complete step number 3, we need to have oxygen. If you don't have oxygen, we can't do step number 3, which means that step number 2 piles up and there's no use doing step number 2. Okay, so glucose gets split into 2 pyruvic acids. If we have oxygen, these 2 pyruvic acids come into this mitochondria, which is the basically a change machine. That's the organelle that transforms the energy found in glucose and other substances, actually, because you can get some energy from breaking down proteins and fats. Okay, but we're keeping it simple right now. So Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, and at the very end, we're going to pump out 3 things. Or actually, I'm not going to use the word pump. That's a bad word. Well, it's not a bad word, but not a good choice of words. We're going to produce 3 things. 2 things go into the mitochondria, glucose and oxygen. 3 things come out. Carbon dioxide, which goes into your bloodstream and you exhale that out. Water, which is good. And 38 quarters in the form of ATP. And I know I keep saying it, but in just a couple seconds, we'll learn what ATP is. That's not too bad. You put $10 of glucose in and you get 38 quarters of ATP out. That's not a bad deal, okay? I'm okay not getting my full 40 quarters. It's not a bad deal, okay? So let's take a look at what ATP is, okay? Let's go on over here. And I don't know why, but I can't shrink this anymore. Ah! All right, well, we'll figure this out. Okay, so ATP is basically, it's called adenosine triphosphate. And it is the form of energy that our cells use. So basically, it's our quarters. ATP is adenosine, and it has 3 negatively charged phosphate groups stuck on to each other in a chain here. And there are springs in between each of these. They're bonds. These guys hate each other, okay? Because you don't want to have a negative thing right next to a negative thing. It's like having 2 norths on the magnets. You can't put them together. They don't want to be together. So all it takes is for us to cut. This last phosphate flies off and does something, and that's how our cells use ATP for energy. When it cuts off, we're left with 2 phosphates stuck to adenosine. We call that adenosine diphosphate, ADP. Di means 2 in chemistry, okay? So again, once we cut off that last phosphate, it goes off and does something. That's where we get our energy from. So now this is like a 2/3 battery. This is 100% full. This is 66%. We can still use this last phosphate on this guy. If we cut this other phosphate off, it's going to take off and do something. And now we're left with AMP, adenosine monophosphate. Mono means 1. Okay? So this is why ATP is so important, because that last phosphate gets cut off through hydrolysis. We add water, we add an H, and we add an OH to it, and we split it just like breaking up the molecules we've been doing all semester. If you hydrolyze that last phosphate, it flies off and it does something. That's why ATP is so important, okay? So to summarize, what we're doing here is we are taking glucose and oxygen, and we're putting them into the mitochondria, basically, and we're producing 3 things. 2 things go in, 3 things come out. CO2, water, and now we know what ATP is. To summarize it, here is the equation. The chemical equation that you must know is C6H12O6, which is glucose, plus oxygen, gives you CO2, H2O, and 36 or 38, depending on how you count it, ATP. This, my friends, is the equation for cellular respiration, okay? We do it, animals do it, plants do it. Yes, plants do something called cellular respiration, especially this time of year. If you look outside, most of the trees that used to have leaves, unless they were fir trees, like pine trees, those leaves have dropped. Those trees still need to obtain energy somehow. They can no longer do photosynthesis because their leaves have dropped. So that means that they have to live off stored glucose that they have been producing all summer, all spring and all summer. So those trees are full of glucose. How do we know this? Well, go up to Vermont, go up to New Hampshire, and drive a stake into the maple trees and boil some of the sap that comes out, and there you have maple syrup. Okay? So these trees are breaking down the glucose right now in the winter. Right now. I can see it. No, I can't. I'm just kidding. Right now, they're breaking down the glucose that they stored over the past few months by doing cellular respiration. Okay? So, no, trees don't breathe. They don't have lungs, but they still originally took in sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide and produced glucose and oxygen. And right now, they're breaking apart the glucose, just as we did in this animal cell up here. They're breaking down the glucose, and they're doing Krebs cycle, an electron transport chain, and they're producing CO2, water, and 38 ATP. That's cellular respiration.